Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar and discussion on dismantling and rebuilding the food system after COVID-19, the 5 Ds of redistribution. My name is Evan Bonus, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability at the Center for Sustainable Food Systems at UBC. I just want to start by drawing our attention to how UBC Vancouver's campus occupies parts of the traditional, ancestral, and unceded, never surrendered territory of the Musqueam people. So I'm a settler from a family of settlers. I came to UBC to study and work and live in Vancouver from Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 territory, and that's where I was born and raised. It's also where I studied at the University of Manitoba, which occupies the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and it's located on the homeland of the Métis Nation. I keep connections to this place. I continue to work with the folks that live there, including some of the folks who helped organize today's event. Earlier this month, I also left what is now called Vancouver, and I moved to the territories of the Tsawwassen, the Wasanich, and the Stamanis peoples. And so my colonial footprint is growing and changing. Our panel today is, as many of you attendees are joining us from other places. So I invite everyone to take a moment to locate yourself, think about where you are, think about where you're coming from, where you've been. On whose territories do you currently reside or have resided? What's your relation to the people of those lands? If you don't know whose territories you're on or where you've been, a good place to start is by going to native-land.ca. Since our topic today is on redistribution, I also invite you folks to think about who currently occupies or owns those lands and what it would look like to return them to their original stewards. So today's webinar is on the 5 Ds of redistribution, is what we're calling it. It's the final session in the Building Resilient Food Systems During COVID-19 and Beyond series, hosted by the Center for Sustainable Food Systems, the BC Food Web, and the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. So the session is organized by the Working Group on Redistribution for Food Systems Transformation, which is a collective of researchers at the Center for Sustainable Food Systems at UBC and the University of Manitoba. The group's supported by the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at UBC. We're really thankful for them and their support. Our group includes Dana James, Tabitha Robin, Dr. Angela McIntyre, Colin Dring, Dr. Annette Aurélie Desmarais, and myself, Evan Bonus, and Dr. Hannah Whitman, who will be moderating our session today. So today's topic is redistribution in the food system. So much academic analysis points to the ways in which land, knowledge, power, and resources are concentrated in contemporary food systems. So our working group has prepared a concept note arguing that the COVID-19 crisis provides a critical opportunity to rethink how food systems are organized, specifically about how resources, benefits, and risks are distributed. So we argue that a transition from concentrated, vulnerable, and unequal food systems to resilient, sustainable, and just ones should happen along what we're calling the 5 Ds of redistribution: decolonization, decarbonization, diversification, Decommodification, democratization, and decommodification. These 5 Ds are drawn from the politics and scholarships of the food sovereignty movement. So in other words, more sustainable food systems would be ones that redistribute power and resources away from private owners and capital and towards indigenous and other historically marginalized communities, towards climate mitigation efforts, towards increasing diversity, towards workers and peoples through democratic institutions. So we also argue in our concept note that food systems need to be rebuilt, not just dismantled. So in addition to the 5 Ds of redistribution, we highlight the 5 Rs of regeneration inspired by indigenous food sovereignty and related literature. So the 5 Rs are relationality, reciprocity, rights, respect, and responsibility. So together, these 5 Ds and 5 Rs form what we're calling 10 principles for food systems transformation in the wake of COVID-19. Today, we're focusing on the 5 Ds. If you want to know a little bit more about the 5 Rs and how all these principles fit together, you can follow along with a couple of papers that we have coming out really soon. We're also working on a new paper using today's discussion as a launching point. So I'm super excited to bring you 5 speakers today, one for each of the 5 Ds. And we've invited them to offer a reflection on our concept note, and we've provided them a kind of a question prompt to share their thoughts with us. So we asked, in your opinion, what is the strongest redistributive policy tool for dismantling the corporate food regime and rebuilding a resilient and just food system along the 5 Ds? So we're absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Charlotte Cote, Dr. Ernesto Mendez, Dr. Seglin Snap, Dr. Mary Hendrickson, and Dr. Neva Hassanin here to share their reflections with us. So each speaker is going to have 10 minutes. So we'll hear from the speakers in just a second, but as a couple points of housekeeping first, after the brief presentations, we'll then move on to a discussion among the panelists, and then we're going to move on to a Q&A session with questions from the audience. If you have any questions for the panelists, please navigate down to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom control panel, and you can share your questions there. You can also upvote questions by clicking on the thumbs up symbol. If you'd like to chat with other attendees, you can feel free to go to UBC Farms Facebook page. That's where we're streaming the event live. There you can use the comment function to exchange messages. Lastly, we'd just like to recognize that we're dealing with some new and can be pretty challenging working conditions here. So please bear with us and bear with the speakers if there are any unexpected distractions, interruptions, or technical issues. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Hannah Whitman now, who's going to introduce the speakers individually, and she's going to moderate our discussion.
Thank you, Evan. It's really great to be here today and be in the same virtual roundtable with some really fantastic and exciting speakers who I've read their work for years, and it's really a privilege to be able to participate in a live discussion. So first up, we have, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Charlotte Cote. Dr. Cote is from the Nachalnith community of Sechelt on the west coast of what is now called Vancouver Island. And she's an associate professor in the Department of American Indian Studies at the University of Washington, which is also my alma mater. She is the author of the book Spirits of Our Whaling Ancestors, Revitalizing Maka and Nachalnith Traditions, and her other publications include Indigenizing Food Sovereignty, Revitalizing Indigenous Food Practices and Ecological Knowledges in Canada and the US. And she's also written Food Sovereignty, Food Hegemony, and the Revitalization of Indigenous Whaling Practices. Her current book focuses on the revitalization of Northwest Coast Indigenous foodways. And Dr. Cote is the founder and chair of the University of Washington's annual Living Breath of Washebold Indigenous Food Symposium. So I'll hand it over to Charlotte, and thank you, everyone.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm just, to begin, I don't usually read my presentation, but because we are on this 10-minute limit, I'm going to read, so bear with me. Usually I work off slides, but then I go off on tangents when I do that. Uhlama flotis, sisha aksuma, zishat, histak shitla tsumaas, nutranof atin. I'm sharing with you my language and telling you that my Koas or indigenous name is Flutis Mayot. I'm Zishat, our ancestral territory is Tsumaas, which was renamed by the colonizers, Port Alberni, or the city of Port Alberni. We are part of the larger nation of Nachalnith, which is on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And I acknowledge that I'm not in my ancestral homelands. I'm in the ancestral homelands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and Tulalip nations, people recognized as Coast Salish. And so to begin, I was asked to formulate my discussion around this question: what is the strongest redistributive policy for dismantling the corporate food regime and rebuilding a resilient and just food system along the principle of decolonization? So I'm going to look at that in the next 10 minutes. So dismantling and building the corporate food regime and rebuilding this resilient and just food system along that principle of decolonization really means strengthening indigenous land and water rights and distributing accordingly those lands that have been taken away because of colonization or impacted because of colonization. And in doing that, it will support our food sovereignty efforts. And so these are just a couple of pictures of me and my Auntie Marilyn enacting food sovereignty through our connections to our fish. We can move to the next slide. So how would decolonization work? Well, the first thing that needs to take place is understanding colonialism, or understanding colonization, and how settler colonialism continues to impact Indigenous communities. And in analyzing settler colonialism, scholars Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang maintain that settlers come with the intention of making a new home on the land, a homemaking that insists on settler sovereignty over all things in their new domain. In order for settlers to make their home, they must destroy and disappear Indigenous peoples that live there. Indigenous peoples must be erased, must be made into ghosts. And Glenn Coulthard, Indigenous scholar Glenn Coulthard, following kind of along the same ideas, asserts that settler colonialism is structurally oriented around the dispossession of Indigenous peoples of their lands and self-determining authority. And so, as an Indigenous food scholar born and raised in my Zishot community, I have studied, witnessed, and experienced how colonization, the ongoing impacts of settler colonialism, federal Indian policy, boarding schools, habitat destruction, socioeconomic marginalization, and the imposition of a Western diet have impacted my people's physical, nutritional, and spiritual health. For Indigenous peoples worldwide, the inability to access our traditional fishing, hunting, gathering, and agricultural sites, and the inability to harvest and eat our ancestral foods has led to food insecurity and an ominous rise in illnesses such as heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune disease, and others, making a return to our subsistence economies and revitalization of our traditional foodways crucial to our very survival. The global economic and social devastation brought by COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, revealed stark contrasts between the fortunate and vulnerable in our societies. Many news stories discussed how this pandemic does not discriminate, and everyone in society is impacted by this disease. Let's see. Oh, yeah, we can stay in here. But while the virus did impact people from all areas of society, it is in the ability of people to respond that is unequal. Here in the US, the virus hit communities of color at a disproportionate numbers because of the racial and economic inequities embedded in the country's system, as well as in Canada. The effect of the coronavirus is compounded for people of color and for our Indigenous communities. Because of these patterns of inequality, many of our Indigenous communities lack the means to reduce the risk of contagion. Just simple things like having fresh, clean water to wash our hands is a difficulty. Our people also live in close quarters with each other, or many people living under one roof, which makes spreading this type of infectious disease that much easier. Many of our communities have high unemployment rates and poverty rates with poor economic conditions. And we also live in areas where there is limited access to healthcare. Second slide, please, or third slide, please. Thank you. Decolonizing and restoring our Indigenous foodways is directly linked to the ability to fight disease by resisting Western and unhealthy foods that were forced on us with colonization. So decolonization demands an Indigenous framework and a centering of Indigenous lands and recognition of Indigenous autonomy. Decolonization requires a repatriation of Indigenous land and life, and to recognize Indigenous sovereignty. And as Tuck and Yang assert, decolonization should not be used as a metaphor for everything, for all things that we need to improve in our societies. It's connected to Indigenous lands. Re-indigenizing our diets is at the heart of the decolonization and cultural revitalization movements we are witnessing in our communities today, and we are doing this through food sovereignty. Next slide, please. The rise of the food sovereignty movement in the 1990s demanded a radical shift from the corporate food regime toward one that was more ecologically sustainable and equitable. Food sovereignty advocates point to the hegemony of transnational capital in the food system as a key problem in global food insecurity. The concept of food sovereignty was framed within a larger rights discourse and the ability for all people to freely and independently produce their own foods in a political framework that recognizes territorial autonomy. The food sovereignty movement challenged the hegemony of transnational capital in the food system, articulating the need to stop viewing food as a commodity and that the political rights to produce and distribute food be returned to the producers and consumers. Next slide, please. Food sovereignty is defined as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. This notion of food sovereignty became a uniting call to small-scale farmers and indigenous peoples throughout the world. While the movement developed in an agrarian-based Latin American context, indigenous peoples with fishing, hunting, and gathering traditions were able to connect to its underlying philosophy that all nations, including indigenous nations, were able to have the right to define strategies and policies and develop food systems and practices that related to our own cultural values around producing, consuming, and distributing food. Out of this, an indigenous foods movement emerged. The growing indigenous food sovereignty movement is positioned within the larger anti-colonial struggle to decolonize our homelands, our bodies, our diets, and our taste buds, and rebuild and strengthen cultural and sacred relationships to the plants, animals, and ecosystems that provide us with healthy and nutritious foods. Indigenous peoples recognize that eating our traditional foods and making the choice to eat these foods is in itself a political act, a resistance to colonialism. It is central to decolonization and is an exercise of self-determination. The next slide, please. Indigenizing the food sovereignty movement means moving it beyond a rights-based discourse to emphasize cultural responsibilities and relationships that indigenous peoples have with our environment, with our non-human kinfolk, and with each other. The next slide, please. My people, the Nuchanalhat, are restoring respectful and meaning relationships with our environment that are situated within this concept of food sovereignty. We are actively engaging decolonization and sustainable self-determination through reinstatement of authority over our hahulhi, our ancestral territory, and through the development of strategies and implementation of policies aimed at the sustainable production and consumption of traditional, I'm just going to check the time here. Time rate. Okay, I'm almost finished. Consumption of traditional foods through ecologically sound food systems. And we maintain that we must honor the wisdom and values of ancestral knowledge and maintaining these respectful relationships with the natural world. This grounded in our principles of u'afluk, which means to take care of, and isak, being respectful. And those are framed within the overarching philosophy of hishukish sawak, everything is interconnected. Final slide, please. Thank you. So in rebuilding the food system after COVID-19, policy leaders need to sit down with Indigenous leaders and negotiate and implement policies that recognize Indigenous lands and water rights and redistribute lands according to these rights. This will support our food sovereignty efforts as we strive to restore health and wellness in our communities. Pleko, thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was amazing. What a wonderful way to open this panel by talking about food as what brings us together and really unites our responsibilities, not just to the ecosystem and the world around us, but to each other. So I appreciate your willingness to start us off in that way. So thank you. I'm very happy to introduce next my friend Ernesto Mendez. Ernesto Mendez is a professor of agroecology and environmental studies at the University of Vermont, where he co-directs the Agroecology and Livelihoods Collaborative. His research and teaching focus on agroecology, agri-food systems, and participatory and transdisciplinary action research approaches. He's worked for over 25 years with smallholder farmers and indigenous communities in Latin America, and he's worked on collaborative agroecology projects across the world. He's written over 50 peer-reviewed articles and chapters, as well as edited 3 books. Ernesto was born and raised in El Salvador and maintains deep connections with his Central American roots. So we'll hear from Ernesto now for about 10 minutes, and then we'll go. Thank you, Ernesto.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. First of all, thanks so much to the working group for organizing this and for inviting me. Like Hannah said, I am an immigrant here from El Salvador, and I am in Vermont, in Wabanaki land. And I didn't quite follow directions as I should have, but I will say that maybe next slide, please. That to me, the strength of this proposal is really that you've included these 5 Ds, even though I got the decarbonization one to look at more closely. I think that the strongest feature that I see in what you've written is that there are these 5 Ds and also the 5 Rs, which I couldn't help but having to say something about a little bit later. So it is an innovative and a grounded approach for food systems transformation that we need to do. And I'm really happy that you're starting by engaging the state. And I really hope that this effort really moves into helping others also do this, because sometimes in agroecology, I know that there's a lot of us that are working with grassroots organizations and social movements, but we also need to engage with the states. I like this picture of food systems because it reminds us of the complexity of agriculture, agricultural systems and food systems, how they interact. And it also reinforces the need to focus on all these 5 Ds: decolonization, decarbonization, diversification, democratization, and decommodification. Next slide, please. So for maybe the biggest strength of the proposal is the fact that you have 5 Ds and 5 Rs. So I needed to say something about the 5 Rs because it reminded me of a recent interaction that I had while doing a workshop from a group from the South American Andes, 3 countries represented, where we were exploring the use of agroecological principles for transformation of food systems. And we were discussing some of these principles and the transformation process. And a lot of the people that were participating from the Andes, their contribution was like, well, we really think we need to add some values and principles from Andean cosmovision: reciprocity, equity, complementarity, and sustainability. And I think the 5 Rs, relationality, respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and rights, reminded me of this, because I see, again, the strength of this proposal is that you have both the 5 Ds and the 5 Rs. In my concluding remarks, I'm going to tell you specifically why. But it also reminds of the imperative to invite and integrate a diversity of systems, of knowledge, and culture. So break our colonial realities and really open up to other systems of knowledge, to other cultures, in order to move forward in this dismantling and rebuilding of food systems. Next, please. So decarbonization is very important because our society right now runs on a lot of fossil fuel, and we're really confronting, as those people in the West Coast know, some severe impacts of climate change. So when we look at food systems as a whole, we see that they represent 19% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that 40% of that 19 is actually coming from agriculture. We have to remember, and this ties to our first speaker, that most of those emissions are coming from countries that, from developed countries that are not necessarily addressing these issues. And a lot of the impacts are falling on less developed countries, which were also the ones most impacted by colonization. So we have to engage with the notion of decolonization and also diversification when we're thinking about decarbonization. So again, like for me, this is really the strength of your proposal, is that you're including all of these issues together as part of the dismantling and the rebuilding. So I'm gonna move into two examples of how I think we can innovate in agroecology in order to improve, in order to decarbonize mostly this agricultural sector. But I do want to lay clear that we also have to work on all the other components of the food system, which you can see in this graph, that range from fertilizer manufacturing to retail, transportation, packaging, etc. Next slide, please. So I see a lot of opportunity, a lot of already work going on agroecological and low emissions landscapes. And I do think that the scale is something that we have to keep in mind here, because as you can see in this picture on the top, it's like an idealized agroforestry landscape by the USDA, National Agroforestry Center. But I believe that a real impact in order to reduce carbon emissions from agriculture really is going to come if we increase the scale of our management for these agroecological systems that produce low emissions. And one of the key features of this is that they are perennial systems. And as you know, a lot of our agriculture right now is really dependent on annual systems with a lot of tillage, with a lot of disturbance to soil, and with very little long-term perennial cover, such as trees, that can really help us reduce those emissions. Even though the landscape should be our focus, we still have to do this work from the farm, also to different functions and taking into account people's livelihoods. Soil health is also a really important piece of this, and our work on soil health, maintaining the biological health of soils and not just thinking about their physical and chemical properties. How does soil health tie in with this more perennial nature of agriculture? And it is a really big shift. The other opportunity that I see that ties to some of the other Ds is the notion that we should break from this idea that we have to manage agriculture as sole property. How can we begin to explore, and here's where the redistribution piece comes in really importantly, about collective and collaborative land stewardship, which is maybe allowing us to attain more food sovereignty, but also other benefits such as lower emissions in agricultural production. And finally, going back to the first speaker, I think that there are a lot of really strong indigenous practices and knowledge as related to these systems, perennial systems, agroforestry systems. The picture in the bottom represents a diversified landscape in Chiapas, Mexico. It's a household managed by shade coffee farmers that also maintain forests, that also have annual crops for food consumption. And I think that we can go back to these sources of knowledge to try to adapt and adopt and bring in all this wisdom that we have that we've kind of left behind with industrialized agriculture. So these are all sources of knowledge and inspiration that we can bring to this notion of decarbonization. Next one, please. And I wanted to give you a local example. I started to think about how the 5 Ds related to this peri-urban agroecological system that we have here in Burlington. The Intervale Center is a nonprofit that manages about 250 hectares of land. You can see in the map in the top right, the city of Burlington, and then next to it is the GIS image of the Intervale. And we've been working hard with them in trying to see the connections to agroecology. So I just did this personal exercise about thinking, well, how does the Intervale connect with decolonization, with decarbonization, diversification, democratization, and decommodification? And I think that I see a lot of opportunities in this space of urban and peri-urban geographies to push some of these bold proposals, albeit with humility, because this is not easy things to do. But I just wanted to make this emphasis on the opportunities that I see in urban and peri-urban systems. Next slide, please. And then just to conclude, I mean, one of the questions we were asked is what kinds of policies do you see as working or not working? What kinds of social actors should be involved? I see, again, one of the most important strengths is this integration of the 5 Ds and the 5 Rs. I see the 5 Rs as the sort of like the guiding beacons as we use agroecology principles, and the 5 Ds more grounded and more focused on redistribution and disengagement with the state. But one of the questions that I have is, if I position myself as an academic, how do you bring me in order to join in this journey of dismantling and rebuilding the food system from my own positionality, and in these areas of research, education, and outreach. I'm also really curious about more focus on the interactions between the 5 Ds and trying to gain opportunities in pushing those together. Because for example, I saw a lot of synergies between diversification and decarbonization. And I'll end by just saying that there is a lot of work that we need to do in engaging all these different actors that need to be on the table. In Spanish, we say diálogo de saberes, which is basically a dialogue of different knowledges. Because, you know, which social actors do we need to bring? I think we need to emphasize bringing those that have been oppressed, those that have not been brought to the table before, those that have been marginalized. And in order to do that, we really need to improve in the way we engage in dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ernesto. I think what's so important to think about even around this table is this last point. Who has a voice in these policy discussions about rebuilding the food system, and what are the pathways to amplify those voices that have been oppressed or who have been erased from a lot of policy conversations around land use and food security and really the future of our food system. So I think that dialogue piece is at the heart of what we're trying to do today is bring these different voices together and try to build together some policies and actions that people can engage in at the different scales. So thank you so much for that. Our next speaker, I'm very delighted to introduce another friend of mine, Dr. Sig Snap. Sig is a professor of soils and cropping system ecology at the Department of Plant, Soil, and Microbial Sciences at the Michigan State University. And she's also the associate director of the Center for Global Change and Earth Observations. She founded the Global Change Learning Lab in Sub-Saharan Africa, and her research interests include agricultural systems, sustainable crop management, integrated nutrient management, and soil health. Key focus for her lab is harnessing biology through cover crops and diversity to enhance carbon sequestration, nitrogen fixation, and phosphorus cycling. And she investigates ecologically sound design of agriculture through multidisciplinary approaches, long-term field experiments, participatory action research, and systems modeling. So thank you, Sig, and I look forward to hearing your ideas.
Well, thank you so very much for this opportunity. What a wonderful group. And I see some really exciting questions in the Q&A. Can't wait to get to that. So yeah, so, and also I just want to say that I grew up Coast Salish land, which is still where my heart is. So I work mostly in Malawi and Michigan these days, and I was thrilled to be given the opportunity to talk about diversity, which of course we're in the midst of a very huge extinction event. So it's really become so important. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about diversity and its challenges and how we might promote it on 3 levels: crop diversity, a little bit about landscape diversity, and food system diversity, which is so critical to what we're talking about today. All right, go ahead. So here is a natural experiment that occurred in 2007 that I just wanted to draw your attention to. Not everyone realizes that crop diversity has continued to drop dramatically. Just since I went to graduate school, we've lost so much diversity on the land as we've moved more and more to monocultures of corn and soybean. And even those are becoming, as we saw in 2007, when there was a huge increase in the price for corn, this made it possible for some farmers to pay their mortgages, but at the price of growing less soybean and wheat and other types of commodity crops by focusing just on corn. So at the same time, about a 10 to 20% shift, which is pretty massive, in field crops in the upper Midwest occurred. There was a monitoring of soybean and their aphids, and also the biocontrol. So the ladybug beetle, you might see in the top there, is actually a really good predator. It consumes thousands of aphids. So next slide, please. What happened was, this landscape ecologist, Doug Landis and colleagues, found that as corn acreage increased and currently soybean acreage decline, aphids and biocontrol were monitored, and aphids, next slide please, were actually not controlled as corn went up. So if you were in an area in the upper Midwest where you had over 50% of your fields in corn, not uncommon, you lost almost all of your biocontrol. So you had to use pesticides in that year or some other control mechanisms. So you can see that all the time we are benefiting from diversity and we don't always know it. Continue, please. So there's another type of diversity that policies have tried to, instead of trying to make every farm become the crop livestock integration they once were, it's not always practical. So through policies that promote farmers swapping ground, as dairy cattlemen and potato growers in Michigan have experimented with, then in fact you can grow alfalfa and rehabilitate land that is really degraded and beat up through growing a lot of potatoes, which is very hard on the ground. Potatoes pretty much need a lot of control because they everything likes to eat potatoes. So you end up with a lot of input. I really recommend eating organic potatoes, if nothing else. If you eat one crop that's organic, do eat potatoes that way. And other ways that we promoted this kind of diversity through cross-farm integration is some production of compost, and also biodiverse cover crops. You know, I'd bring up cover crops. So in the left there, so biodiversity through that. All of these ways produce and support the biodiversity, little micro animals as well. So the little micro fauna and livestock underground, under our feet and in our guts all the time through this diversity, through cross-farm integration. Next slide, please. So next, let's think about landscape diversification. In addition to each field shown here, having cover crops and field crops that are more diverse, we need to support through policies so that farmers can grow filter strips, windbreaks, grow these perennials and bushes you heard about from Ernesto, that we need to see more diversity of the entire landscape, perennial grasses, perennial grains, as we develop these. And a fundamental point I hope you take away is that on the left here, you can see that soil organic matter, carbon, this was very important to, and it was one of the decarbonizations, right? That we need to stop losing our carbon to the atmosphere and instead tying it up in soil organic matter, which helps farmers and all of us adapt to extreme weather. You get, whether it's too much rain, as we're often seeing, or drought, higher soil organic matter will help you survive. So it's good in a practical way, but it's also important as an important carbon sink to reduce both adapt and mitigate climate change. And the takeaway here is, in the dark circles, is what you can achieve with no-till and these other no disturbance approaches, which are being promoted widely. But unless you have diversity of crops, you don't see the increase in soil carbon that we really want to see. So a number of meta-analysis, research is really coming around, and also citizen science, farmers' own observations, that just mixtures of cover crops, mixtures of crops themselves, they're really fundamental, that diversity, to see increases in soil carbon. So we can't do it through chemical intensive no-till alone. And it's important to know this. In many circles, there's other approaches that have been kind of overcoming. Okay, next slide, please. So let's talk about food system diversity. In 2006 is also where we started to see the really fundamental problem with some of this consolidation that's going on. So there was an outbreak, you might remember, of E. coli in spinach. And it turned out that the diversity of farms, happened to be in California, was really mitigated by a commingling of spinach. All these different farms and fields on those farms were producing spinach, all being mass processed. So one part of one field could have an E. coli outbreak, and it would then contaminate all the other spinach. So this might be an argument away from consolidation, you would think. And the so-called diversification you might see in different labels for spinach is actually it looks apparent, but it's actually not what's occurring. The spinach you buy sometimes will all be from this commingled process. So we really are seeing less and less diversity in the food system, and it's happening all the time. So it's important to keep this in mind, that we need to move forward from this. Can you have the next slide, please? And unfortunately, the reaction was not that we need to see more diversity in types of food system. At least in the US, what happened was a further centralization of the food system, in that a wild pig, if you can believe it, was blamed as the source. And it was a source in one time of the E. coli. And this was kind of magnified everywhere. Although there was certainly some consolidated livestock operations that were involved, that were nearby some of these fields where these outbreaks occurred. But so the idea became, if we had these strips of bare soil around fields, and these are being enforced with 50-foot spacing of rodent traps, then we could stop animals running through our fields. And that was the major problem. I think you'll see the fallacy of this. So what we need to do is, okay, next slide, please. Move away from this, because we're now seeing too that people, in May 1st, 20 people dead and almost 5,000 people sickened, but now it's in tens of thousands of people at these food processing plants. Another point of processing, it turns out there's only a few of them, and people are quite vulnerable in them to COVID. So this is yet another warning. If we cannot rely on these highly consolidated and lack of diverse systems. And there is a real upsurge in demand for local food now. People are realizing you need to know your farmer. Next, final slide, please. So in Chicago, there's been policies that have really promoted a proliferation of different types of traditional and new types of farmers markets. And this has led to new markets for farmers. The farmers cannot start producing unless they have a way to sell it in our current system. So this has led to proliferation in surrounding areas, peri-urban and in rural areas, of production in diverse ways. And you can see the fruits and vegetables here that are really at the heart of this kind of more diverse and healthier farm system. So I see that we need to be thinking about community health, whether it's in the soil below your feet or at your local market, and involve all the different chains, points of diversity along that chain. Thanks very much. I look forward to more discussion and this amazing panel and all I can learn today. And I hope we get to discuss this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sig. Looking at all that food being grown made me a little bit hungry. It's wonderful to see how diversification isn't just about what we grow on the land, but also how this food is exchanged and what are the social relationships around how food moves from one place to another. So that's also really important. Thank you. Next up, we get to hear from Dr. Mary Hendrickson. Mary is an associate professor in the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri. She's a rural sociologist whose passion is making the world a better place through food. And she studies the way food production and consumption has changed over the past few decades and how farmers, eaters, and communities can create more sustainable food systems. She teaches sustainable food and farming courses at University of Missouri and was a Fulbright scholar to Iceland, where she taught how sustainable agriculture can take place. From 1997 to 2012, she also worked to create local food systems in Missouri as an extension sociologist, gaining valuable on-the-ground experience in transforming food systems. So thank you, Mary. You're next up.
Great, thank you. I am so humbled to be here with this panel, and I'm just like, this is amazing. I'm learning so much. And I'm also humbled and ashamed to admit that I had to go and look after Dr. Cote's presentation. I had to look and see again the First Nations that were here in the land that we occupy, which in Missouri, and which I include the Osage, the Oto, the Chickasaw, which were colonizer names for the lands we occupy here at the University of Missouri. I also want to acknowledge, like Evan said, I grew up in a settler family, like many of us did, in Nebraska, and I remain a landowner in Nebraska of my family's farm, which was located in the Kaw Nation. So I struggled with this decommodification of food and agriculture, and I'm not sure I feel very much up to the task here, but I'm going to give it a go. And I think I'd really build on many of the things that the other speakers have said. So if you could go to my first slide, please, the second slide, I should say. Obviously, what we've been talking about is that food is too important to be left to the market. It has social implications, it has cultural implications, it has ecological implications. It's part of everything, and it's just too important to be left to the market, which many of us have argued for a long, long time. The next slide, please. But it is left to the market. Unfortunately, in the United States and Canada, it is primarily left to the market. Not always, and as we just heard about, there's a lot of different kinds of things happening. When it's left to the market, what I have been looking at in the tradition of my Missouri School of Rural Sociology, we've been looking at consolidation and concentration for quite some time here. My colleague Phil Howard at at Michigan State University, many of you might know, says that we have to understand this as a mode of power. And we're often actually looking at it as a mode of production. We think about the economic and political power there, but we think about it in prioritizing profits and thinking about the accumulation strategies of firms. His point is, if we think about it as a mode of power, we see consolidation is driven by the quest for power by the dominant firms, and they measure their power in relation to other dominant firms. So their capitalization, their rate of growth as compared to others. Now, if we think about it as power, we look at the concentration. Agrochemicals, 65% of those are controlled by 4 firms. Commercial seeds, proprietary seeds, 53% globally we're talking about. And if I went through a lot of the markets that farmers rely on, these are also consolidated and concentrated. So if we think about it as a mode of power, next slide, please, then what you're talking about with the 5 R's is really thinking about how we tackle that power, we redistribute that power, we rebalance that power. And the questions become in the marketplace, in the political sphere, in our own lives. So I'm interested in that question in many different aspects. And I think we've heard about the rebalancing already. Next slide, please. One way to think about then, if we want to decommodify, we have to think of food as not a commodity, but as a commons. And there's a wonderful book out, Handbook of Food as a Commons, that came out last year. When we think about food, as we have been discussing today, if we think about food as a commons, then its production and distribution responds to the logic of solidarity and mutual help, rather than to the logic of competition and exclusion. Because as people, we recognize mutual neediness and the essentiality of eating as a human activity that is social, cultural, and physiological. So thinking about food as a commons is very radical, very transformative, and is that essentially what you are proposing with the 5 Ds and the 5 Rs. Next slide, please. But the question becomes, how do we get there? And I feel actually very inadequate to the task of, oh, how do we get there? If we think of food as a commons, the authors of that handbook propose that we have to reconceptualize governance in the food system, and to really think of it from reshaping market rules, reshaping public regulation, so rethinking the market, rethinking the state, and prioritizing actually self-regulated collective actions, and prioritizing that in balance with the state and the market. But we also can think about this in terms of resilience, which I've written on resilience and been thinking about it a little differently than the way you're thinking about it, which is wonderful, because I think it is we need a lot of attention paid to this concept of resilience. But resilient food systems can accommodate change, but that they can accommodate change because there's a diversity of organizational forms. And I like Dr. Snapp's presentation of the diversity, food system diversity, but there's also a redundancy of role and functions. And redundancy of role and functions means that we are not thinking about efficiency, and we're particularly not thinking about dominant firms who are protecting their eliminating redundancy of role and functions across the board, which happens when when mergers happen. All the time, you reduce and streamline and make more efficient, according to them, the roles of the firms. So if we're going to do food as commons and a resilient food system, we have to have this diversity of organizational forms. We have to have this redundancy of role and function, and we have to think about latitude to accommodate change. Next slide, please. So here's my very inadequate attempt to think about some decommodification. And I know you've also been thinking about universal basic income and on the consumption side, but I want to talk a little bit about some incremental and some what I consider more transformative that actually gets us closer to food as commons. But if we think incremental, and I think it's really important, as I always remind my students, that the seeds of what are going to be are planted right now. So what is coming is being born out of what we have. And we have a crisis, obviously, but there are things happening that are going to blossom and bloom into something more transformative. So what can we do that is incremental? And I'm based in the United States, so I've been really focused on competition policy. But competition policy happens in all forms in many different countries, right? Can we, in competition policy or antitrust policy, could we think about rebalancing power? Like, could we have stress tests of firms for resilience? Most of them would fail, as COVID highlighted. So does that give us the possibility of saying, okay, we need to rethink the organization and potentially even break them up? Could we consider resilience as part of the merger and acquisition decisions? could we consider fairness in contract law? Could we think about consideration of scale and diversity in contract law and competition policy? And then, of course, we need to rethink what is subsidized and how. Are we thinking we're going to subsidize eaters and workers? Are we going to prioritize and subsidize attempts at food justice instead of what we currently subsidize, particularly here in the United States, where we subsidize a lot of farmer transferring of payments directly to those dominant firms through seed costs and so on. Much more transformative kinds of actions would be reshaping forms of production consumption relationships like we see with community supported agriculture, which is a totally different way of negotiating production and consumption. It shares risks and rewards. Could we think about communal land ownership, which African American farmers in the United States have undertaken, particularly Monica White writes about this, but also Shirley Sherrod's projects in Georgia have had a very storied history, but also have been subjugated by the dominant system. And then we have to think about fundamental needs for food considered in absolutely every decision. One of the big things we have to think about is the interconnections between the multiple scales, that many of these things are about local action, but they are impacted through these at the global scale. So these are things that we have to kind of shape out, and I look forward to discussing that a little bit more. Next slide, please. So thank you very much. And you can find some of my work if you're interested in these places. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was great. And I think really provocative about what are the mechanisms that we have as consumers, as people acting every day in the food system to influence what's happening in the market, and then what, where do we need to go more into the political sphere to change things. So that's actually a really provocative entry point into our discussion. So I'm very grateful for that, and I'm happy to introduce our very last speaker. You guys have been really, really good about keeping on time, so I'm really happy to have tons of time for discussion after this. Dr. Neva Hassanein. Dr. Neva is a professor of environmental studies at the University of Montana. As an engaged scholar, she and her students help strengthen Montana's food system through community-based research projects and active partnerships. Her recent scholarship develops the concept of food democracy, the idea that people can and should meaningfully participate in shaping the food system rather than remain passive consumers on the sidelines. Her work has explored various issues such as farmland loss, regional markets, pesticides, the U.S. organic program, and biotechnology. She's quite active beyond the academy, currently serving her 5th year on the Missoula City County Consolidated Planning Board. So thank you, Neva, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for including me in this event. It's really an honor to, like Mary said, to share this virtual stage with you all. I also really want to give a shout out to Evan, who has done a tremendous job organizing. I'm sure other people have been involved too, but that Evan is the one I've engaged with consistently. I guess I want to start off by saying I really took this idea seriously. What could be the strongest redistributive policy tool that might dismantle the corporate food regime along the principle of democratization? As an activist scholar, I've really tried to think about what specific things we can do in our communities, in our countries to advance change. And it's nice that I'm following up on Mary because, as you all know, and you all have heard today, the dominant food system is characterized by concentration of tremendous economic power held by a small number of firms. That power tends to be concentrated in the middle of the food chain, so essentially creating like a choke point in the system. As a result, these agribusiness firms exert considerable control in both directions, right, over producers and over consumers. And as has been well established in the literature, The corporate food regime controls much of the research and development related to the food system today. That control extends not only to the commercialization of university science, but also to the limitations or prohibitions on conducting fully independent research. And today, in this digital era, these corporations collect, store, and process so-called big data from both producers and consumers, which in turn increases their control. As an example, John Deere collects a wide variety of information from the computers that are in the tractors and so on today. So as we think about governance, we have to acknowledge that it's more than the state. Governance also takes forms in the private sector in the food system, especially those that are vertically integrated. And so, for instance, as many of you know, contracts often dictate practices, and the firms set up their own mechanisms to arbitrate disputes. They have essentially set up their own governance structures. I believe, like Mary, that food is too important to be left up to these unregulated monopolies. I've found the idea of food democracy as a useful way to help me think about how to shift some of these power relations. The core of food democracy is this idea that people can and should be able to actively and meaningfully participate in shaping food systems. Solutions to the problems in the food system must be determined in large part by meaningful civic participation and political engagement by informed and educated people. In other words, democracy depends on knowledge. Individuals and civil society organizations need to have equal opportunity to participate in the decisions that affect our lives. And we need access to reliable and accurate information that's necessary to make those decisions effectively. Right now, much of that information is not available to the public, nor equally distributed in society. Data has become one of the world's most valuable resources, and it's being collected constantly, 24 hours a day. So as I thought about the question for this panel, a variety of answers came to mind, like overhauling campaign finance reform, vigorously enforcing antitrust laws. Any hope of democratic governance must address these fundamentals. None of these are silver bullets. We need lots of tools. But I didn't want to take that academic cop-out and just say, well, we need lots of things. So the major tool I want to talk about next is the public's right to know. This is a legal and moral principle. The principle of the right to know holds that certain government or company data must be made available to individuals who have a right to know their contents. Freedom of Information Acts are an example. So they provide for the public's right to know and request information from the government and get their records. Agencies must provide that information unless it's specifically exempt. In Silent Spring, Rachel Carson called upon the public to assert its right to know as a way to discover whether or not we were being asked to take senseless risks. The concept later made its way into both occupational and environmental law, providing mechanisms by which people could get information about which chemicals they're exposed to. Now, these calls for the right to know really gained traction following the Bhopal disaster in 1984, and some of us are old enough to remember that. That was when the Union Carbide plant in India leaked methyl isocyanate, which is a pesticide, and it exposed 500,000 people to it. As a result of that, one of the world's most worst industrial disasters, activists started pushing for legislation about the right to know to hazardous exposures. So this ended up with laws in the United States, for instance, called the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, which it relates to industrial facilities who have to disclose information about their annual releases of toxic chemicals into communities and make that information available to the public. Now, with respect to the food system, I think we need a major expansion of right to know legislation. We need to cover all kinds of information about how food is produced, the conditions under which it is people work in the food system, as well as consumer information regarding ingredients, nutrition, the source of our food, and so on. In other words, we need comprehensive, reliable, and specific data all along the food chain. One way to know this is a powerful concept is how hard the corporate food regime has fought these kinds of initiatives. Here's a few quick examples. For instance, in the United States, the country of origin labeling law, commonly known as COOL, was passed in 2002. It was never fully implemented. The USDA created loopholes big enough to drive a semi through. And then in 2015, Congress repealed it completely under pressure from the meat packers, resulting in lower prices for cattle producers and less information for consumers. Conventional and organic farmers lack information on where field trials for genetically modified organisms are conducted. So experiments go on without much oversight, and you might be exposed, your farm might be exposed without you knowing it. The agrochemical firms spent millions of dollars in Washington state to kill the labeling initiative for genetically modified organisms. Likewise, they've fought hard to against efforts to secure our right to know about pesticide use, which is something I worked on in the late 90s, trying to get legislation like that passed in Oregon. Only a few states in the United States have pesticide right to know, which makes it extremely difficult to carry out studies on things like human health or environmental contamination. Other areas we might want to demand the right to know about might include things like market transparency and price discovery. And if there's questions about that, I'm hoping Mary will help me. But really, we need things like disclosure of captive supplies among the large feedlot owners. So I hope during our discussion, we can think about other ways that we might assert the public's right to know throughout the food chain and provide useful information to consumers and producers. We need to regain some control over this constant collection of information that is occurring by the corporations and is not made public. Just because the corporate food regime has fought these initiatives does not mean we should abandon them. Polls consistently show that the public supports their right to know. Now, it's not that knowledge in itself will create change, right? For knowledge to be meaningful, it has to be aligned with the civic power to act preventatively and proactively. Knowledge is, I'm almost done, sorry. Knowledge is only potential power, right? Activists and public intellectuals can use these data to mobilize people and gain power to transform food systems. I can imagine the use of creative tools like story maps, things I don't even I barely even know about, but could be used to disclose information in a compelling and motivating way for the public. This also implies the idea that we should have an opportunity to participate in technology assessment before these tools are introduced. The corporate food regime has distanced us in a variety of ways. And that distancing disempowers us, as my good friend Jack Kloppenberg wrote once, and that if we don't if we don't know, we can't act. So knowledge alone won't solve the problems in the food system, but it seems to me a crucial piece in the puzzle in advancing democratization, dismantling corporate power, and rebuilding a more just and ecologically sound food system. Democracy depends on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Neva. And I think it's really fitting that we've closed the panel on this question of the concentration of knowledge and how to really re-engage that as the basis for untangling some of the other aspects of our food system that have been commodified, consolidated, dispossessed, and stolen. You know, if we start with land as the fundamental. So I'm really excited that we get to move now into our discussion part of our panel. So I'd like to invite the panelists to turn on their video and rejoin us around the virtual table. One of the kind of driving motivations for the Peter Wall Institute to fund and host these virtual roundtables is to really try to reproduce that excitement of people being in the same place and really being able to generate ideas with each other in a more interactive way. So we have a good 20 minutes now to just converse amongst ourselves as a panel. We have the opportunity for you to ask questions to each other, to expand on something that you maybe wanted to expand on from your talk. And so, you know, I can throw a question on the table to start, but we're not tied to this. And the question that kind of came up as a thread through all the 5 panels for me was kind of the intersectionality between these processes. And I noticed that an audience member asked about, you know, which one should we prioritize first, or what would be the lowest hanging fruit to sort of pursue in terms of a policy intervention, and then thinking about really the importance of using a systems approach, which doesn't allow us to sort of pick and choose where to begin. And maybe we could go around in the same order that we started with just some initial thoughts on how your work or how the communities that you're working with have really disentangled the paralysis that many of us, I think, face when trying to engage in systemic change, which is precisely where do we start, where are the entry points, and how do we work together with others, especially facing the diversity of contexts in which people and communities find themselves. So maybe we'll start with Charlotte, and then we can just maybe popcorn around. If you'd like to use the Zoom raise hand feature, that's a good way for me to keep track of who wants to talk. But for now, we'll just start going in the same order. So Charlotte.
Okay. Well, thank you, Pleco to all the speakers. It was wonderful and interesting that we did not come together before this to discuss what we were presenting on, but they all really did a good job of interacting and connecting with each other on many different levels around those 5 Ds. And I don't know what was presented outside of our group or with people who are on this Zoom or on the webinar in looking at these areas. What is the strongest redistributive policy tool for dismantling the corporate food regime, and then looking at decolonization, decarbonization, diversification, democratization, and decommodification. And I spoke to decolonization, and not in the sense of decolonizing the food system. And actually, I pushed back on that in my presentation with Tuck and Yang, making it very clear that we can't continue to use that word as the word that that you take to represent everything that is wrong in society, that we need to decolonize our schools, or we need to decolonize the system. It can't be used as a metaphor. It really needs to be placed within within the Indigenous struggle, which is why my presentation was focused on that. But that doesn't mean that we can't work together and come together and build collaborative networks and partnerships around how to rebuild a system, especially that we see a system that has exposed the vulnerabilities in our societies based on a lot of it based on race, around social injustice, racial injustice, and how these are embedded in state systems. So it makes it really difficult as partners for Indigenous peoples and as partners to engage in this kind of work and rebuilding larger global systems when we're just fighting for our own basic needs in our communities. And so what I see in finding, in moving forward, is really creating these kinds of spaces to build these kinds of, to raise these kinds of questions and to engage in these meaningful and respectful relationships as we move forward. And so a lot of what the other speakers covered really, I think really did a good job of that. How do we come together? A lot of this looking local, really looking at what's happening in these communities. And I would say we are part of that as an Indigenous peoples. What are we doing in our communities? What can the larger global society, especially around changing the corporate food regime, how can what we do as Indigenous peoples support those changes? And so I talked a little bit about that in my presentation, in bringing as some of you have said, bringing that power back in the hands of the local, and also bringing that power back in the hands of Indigenous peoples, because for us it is cultural and basic survival. We cannot destroy our lands and move somewhere else. We have very intimate ties to those landscapes and also to what feeds us. And I think revisiting and rethinking about our relationships to food have to be a part of that. And many of you touched on that, seeing food beyond it becoming this commodity within the larger global food system and food regimes, and thinking about food as kin, as relatives that are feeding themselves and allowing us to survive with that food, that sustenance they give us. So I just wanted to throw that out to begin the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. So I guess we'll turn to Evan. I mean, not to Evan, sorry, Ernesto. Evan,
starts with an E. So, and I will share a little bit about my background, that I am trained in the natural sciences in ecology and agriculture, and brought those together for agroecology. And that's been, you know, the focus of my career, probably I will say until the last 10 years. And Agroecology and Livelihoods Collaborative here at UVM, which I co-direct with Martha Caswell, we recently did an exercise about what themes do we want to focus on moving forward as a collaborative, as a community of practice that is learning together. And we came up with 3 themes, agroecological performance being one, food sovereignty and agroecology being another one, and the third one being innovative pedagogy for agroecology. But what I will say is that I have a very strong opinion, which really goes against my training, that the areas that we need to focus on more are the areas that are justice related. I've come to really believe that if we don't address the issues of injustice, you know, in food systems and in our society, we're never going to be able to dismantle and then rebuild our food system, because capitalism is so grounded in injustice. So I believe that food sovereignty, anti-racism in food systems, and food justice are really, probably should be our priority, without, of course, not thinking about the ecology of the natural resource base of agricultural and food systems and humanity as a whole. But if I would have to prioritize of where to start, that's where I would start. And you know, supporting the rights of Indigenous people of color, of developing countries that have been colonized and exploited. That's right. That's really where what I would prioritize, because, you know, in my times as an agroecologist, what I've seen is that those are the issues that always keep, those are the issues that are left behind. And then we are surprised why we have this food system or society that is so unjust. And a lot of the issues that we're talking about really, all of them have a justice perspective that needs to be addressed, all these 5 Ds. And again, you guys have done a good job of coming up with these 5 Rs that are sort of like guiding principles for how to do this work. Thank you.
So Sig, how does this idea of a justice focus, how has that worked with your work in Malawi, for example, which, you know, started out as very agronomic in nature? Might be interesting to have an example of how you saw that work change and what impact it has on the ground once a justice focus started being used.
Well, I was really just thinking about this in terms of what was raised earlier. I really liked what Neva raised about bringing us back to the example of the Silent Spring. And I think civil society, even citizen science, has to be thought about here. That in Malawi, there's been a reawakening of civil society. And in fact, the president who stole the election was pushed out after 9 months of civil society growing, which is amazing in a colonial country that was under a despot for so many years through the mid-90s. And they forced a peaceful transition in 1994, and then recently forced a re-election and stepping down of an illegal president, which didn't make the news, apparently. Most people don't know this. But it's a really amazing example of how civil society, and then thinking more about food systems within Malawi, we've been trying to bring back to farmers and to extension and community activists the actual tools to make measurements of soil organic matter, of food security. So I think, and then helping develop this curriculum among some participatory farmers. So people that we've worked with for a long time, and this has come out of some 30 years of work, we've been able to enable, and through civil societies, not just us, civil society has grown in Malawi to the point where now people are starting to put demands on let's move away from these systems like relying on large doses of fertilizer, which are enabled through subsidies, which are, Malawi is somewhat famous for supposedly a green revolution in Africa. But to me, it's actually, they're missing the whole point. There's actually been an agroecology revolution in parts of Malawi. And there are many people rejecting that reliance on fertilizers. And part of it comes from the evidence of their own eyes that for their families to be healthy, for the soil to be healthy, then we're giving them better ways to make measurements of that. And then now there's actually a group of farmers and an extension colleague I work with, Diamond Kambewa, who are going to the Ministry of Agriculture, and they're going to get to put pressure on them about the subsidies just being for fertilizers. They want diversity of seeds and they want more education. So I feel like we've really seen some profound changes there, and yet we get overwritten by this narrative that it's a green revolution that occurred, but it's actually a people's revolution that there is signs of, and we're some small part of. So I don't know if that's, I hope that's somewhat encouraging, but I want to point out the big data can also be about citizen science if it's in the right hands. Although I agree that so much of it's being taken away, and that, you know, back to Silent Spring, that led to EPA being established in the US, which has been recently dismantled. But it, you know, to me, I'm really put my hopes into civil society. Someone asked in the chat about, couldn't we look at the costs of the true costs of the food system? And yes, ecological economists do that. And there's lots of metrics to try and look at true costing of things. But I think you have to also have, in addition to the academics and the research, you have to have civil society and citizen scientists putting pressure on, say, look, these are the real costs. You know, it's polluted waterways. And this is what's happening in my area. It's lack of food in downtown Detroit. So those kind of things, we need to give a voice for that, to put pressure till we change the policy so they don't just enable, you know, really subsidization of fertilizers, for example, which has also, back to my crop diversity, one last point, crop diversity is disappearing in large part because we've subsidized massively a whole green revolution type of crop that requires fertilizers. So it puts us in a fossil fuel, high input demand, kind of on that highway. And there is although there's a little bit of upgrowth of agroecology lately, we still are kind of missing a lot of the, not just traditional crops, but even the new ones that we could create. But I'm looking to civil society to put pressure to change that, because otherwise these subsidies keep going the other direction. So I think this is a great format to even broaden the discussion more. Thanks.
Yeah, Sig, your remarks are really creating a triangle between this idea of democratization of knowledge and then how that links to the application of state resources, for example, that there's a certain knowledge paradigm controlled by the corporate food regime and the sort of research industrial complex that has sort of directed states to invest in certain kinds of food production strategies. And those food production strategies involve dispossession of people, land, and nature. And so kind of breaking that apart to say, well, it's not just land that needs to be redistributed and repatriated, but also knowledge needs to be access to knowledge and ownership of knowledge, and sort of the mechanisms of production of knowledge also need to be sort of expanded. So yeah, this is really making really nice connections between the panelists' remarks here. And so I think moving to Mary, like, how do you see knowledge itself being decommodified, and how can indigenous communities, farming communities globally kind of push back against this corporate consolidation of the narrative around how food systems should be? I see a lot of these corporations using words like agroecology and resilience and sustainability, and it's definitely not the same kind of definitional content that maybe some of us would put to those words. So yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts on connecting that.
Well, I was gonna, you always pose the really hard questions here, Hannah. I wanted to go back though to Ernesta's and Sig's remarks about justice. And I don't think that we can forget justice, interspecies justice as well. And I just wanted to point out something that builds on something Sig said earlier. With the COVID crisis in meatpacking, at one point in time, Smithfield's South Dakota plant was closed down, and that was about 20% of all the packing capacity for hogs in the U.S. at that point in time. And that's about 19,000 pigs a day, if I remember correctly, that are slaughtered. And this is beyond our capacity to really, I mean, there's knowledge and then there's understanding. And it's almost beyond our capacity to understand, right? 19,000 pigs. When I heard this, I was thinking, oh my God, what are people gonna do? What are the farmers gonna do with, I mean, it's a worker catastrophe, I'm not ignoring that. But now you have all of these pigs that are backed up, that are ready for market because it's just in time. So I did some calculations with that. And if you read the Ag Press, you found out that they estimated between 300 to 800,000 pigs were euthanized during the meatpacking crisis. Euthanized. Now that's estimates. We don't know for sure what happened, possibly 1 million. If you think about that, that's about 29,000 pounds of pork, or tons, 29,000 tons of pork. This is beyond our comprehension almost, right? But that's ecological. The waste of resources, the nature of that is absolutely astounding and breathtaking and heartbreaking, and there are no words for that. It's a worker catastrophe, but it was an ecological catastrophe as well, and they're all interconnected. And then if you think about the corn that was produced to feed those pigs, if you do some calculations, it's like 0.03 just a little under 1% of the corn crop is just thrown away for nothing. And the ecological destruction that accompanies that is breathtaking. So I think that, you know, maybe back to your understanding, the right to know, I mean, the right to know is also about understanding and comprehending and absorbing what this actually means. And that power that these firms had, and then they got themselves declared essential, and, you know, they had to go to work, and there was, I mean, it was an ecological disaster, it was a worker disaster, and it's because of the mode of power. And then finally, I would just say around this, there was a question in the chat about subsidies, and I think Sig brought it up as well. And while I don't deny there are been these subsidies, I think the issue is that the firms that they are able to capture the state to the extent that they can structure these subsidies for themselves, right? So, you know, Phil Howard has written about how JBS and WH Group, both meat packers, were able to acquire significant funding from state governments. And WH Group, they got like, I don't know, $1 billion loan approved in a couple of days, something like that. I mean, it may not have been $1 billion, but it's huge amount of money approved. And so that mode of power is actually really important in how it shapes the state. And I think that's what that Charlotte was making reference to too, in terms of these settler or colonial strategies are absolutely critical to rethink. So anyway, I don't know that I answered your question, Hannah. And I find these things, the other thing I wanted to say is the paralysis, address the paralysis. I always tell my students, because people are overwhelmed, especially if I talk about corporate concentration. I mean, who wants to talk about this gloomy, horribly dark stuff, right? And I'm like, you got to do, there's a lot of wrong answers, but there are many right answers. And there are many places to work and to do. And that, you know, we should be, do what we can, right? Do it with knowledge, do it in relationship, but we should start. And that is maybe the most important.
Yeah, start somewhere. And through relationships, I mean, it's an amazing way to start, especially for students. Like, create a relationship, start small. So Neva, where does democratization fit with all of this? Democratizing power, land, resources, knowledge. Break it all down.
Well, you know, the reason why I have been attracted to democratization is that, to me, it suggests an opportunity for us to gain more control, essentially, over something as important as food. And of course, you know, democracy is kind of a work in progress. There's a lot to be fixed, at least in our country. And so I guess I just want to respond to a couple of things. I think Mary's making a good point about knowledge versus understanding. I use the word information and knowledge almost interchangeably in my talk. And it's not because I'm kind of being sloppy, I guess, but, you know, really what they are different. And we do live in this sort of information age, so to speak. And there's, as I said, tremendous amount of data being collected on us. I guess one thing I want to add to this conversation is what questions aren't asked, right? We have this knowledge, so you can call it a knowledge monopoly if you want. What questions don't get asked? So for instance, in the 1990s, the US Geological Survey did extensive testing for pesticides in 18 major basins, really big basins here in the United States. And once former President Bush came into office, they just wiped out that program. So it's kind of akin to what President Trump said a few months ago when he said, if we just stop testing, the cases would go down, right? Which is obviously ridiculous, right? But we apply that same mentality to our water, our air, the soil, and if we don't ask those questions, if we don't demand that those questions be asked, they're not going to be, and then we really, are left with a major problem. And so I guess I just wanted to add that it's not only about accessing information, it's also about which questions aren't we asking that we need to be asking. So I just leave it there because I know there's a lot of questions I want to hear from participants before we lose them.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful, I think, kind of sum up of the many intersections between, the ideas that we can't just pursue one silver bullet strategy to refix the food system. We have to approach it on many fronts. We have to call it the buckshot strategy. So I'd like to actually we have a ton of questions from the audience. So some of them have been upvoted, and so we're going to use a bit of a crowd voting here. But I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and I've kind of picked ones, and I'll start with directing it to one panelist, and if others want to join in, they can add some additional comments. So the first question is for Charlotte, and the question is, when talking about engaging the state through policy, is it possible to achieve decolonization through Western colonial governments and institutions? Or does decolonization actually require or necessitate the dismantling of these institutions? So this is a zinger of a question, but maybe from your, bringing it down to where we are in your work with Coast Salish communities, with your own community, do you think it's possible to achieve any kind of decolonial rebuilding of the food system within the current governance structure, or does the state need to be overcome? We won't bind you to your answer, but it's, a lot of students ask me this question all the time, and it's a really hard one.
Oh, they ask me this all the time.
Yeah.
In my classes. And you can't just answer it in a few minutes. It requires a lengthy discussion and historical analysis of how we came to the place we're in. But I will focus on one area, not just this dismantling, but how, because when you look at that, then you place the onus on what the governments need to do in this dismantling process. And that's why in my conversation, and I mean, in a 10-minute presentation, you can't really cover a lot, but what I say, when I'm looking at more specifically and looking at areas around food sovereignty or food autonomy, that we in our communities now are moving beyond just looking at the discourse of food sovereignty to correct what has happened to us as a result of colonization and the perpetuation of settler colonialism, which still exists. I don't know, I mean, yes, we'd love to see some kind of dismantling of this larger system, but we're at the point where we're saying we don't care anymore. Because what we're going to do, it's going to come from internal changes. And one is by indigenizing food sovereignty so that the conversation goes back into our communities and what we're doing. We're not going to wait for our right to food sovereignty be acknowledged by the states, because that would, we've got a lot that we need to engage with in order for that to happen. But we can do things in our communities now, and we're doing them. In my community, we've continually stayed connected to our fishing rights. So water, not just lands, but water is very important to us. And we're not waiting. I mean, we just went through in the last couple of weeks a major battle with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in order to have our fishing rights recognized in my community. So that's just one example of this, the tensions that continue to exist with the state. But if we as Indigenous peoples look internally and say, well, what are we going to do? understanding that we recognize ourselves as autonomous nations, we can then move forward and move beyond any kind of rights-based discourse and start re-engaging with our landscapes, with the plants and animals that provide themselves as food in this very respectful and responsible way, so that we hopefully can become part of those larger discourses around dismantling the food regime, just by seeing what we're doing, by people seeing what we're doing in our communities. And I think that that is an area that we need to focus on, and where we can all work together. You know, it doesn't have to be that we're all doing our own small or looking at our own areas and dealing. We can look at these larger issues around global food insecurity and rebuilding a just food system. And as Ernesto said, you know, it includes conversations also around racial and social injustice that's embedded in many states' systems. We need those kinds of conversations to be included in these conversations around rebuilding a just and equitable global food regime. So I know that doesn't answer the question, but hopefully the person who asked it, it'll provide maybe some other ideas that she or he can think about.
Yeah.
And that broader question that was asked.
Yeah, Neva, go ahead. You'll have to unmute though, yeah.
Real briefly, Charlotte, I really appreciated your comments there. One of the reasons why I have somewhat steered away from the food sovereignty discourse is that I feel like it's really rooted in people's efforts to overthrow colonialism. And I think food democracy is certainly a part of that food sovereignty, but I see it as really like, I don't want to appropriate it, in other words, and be, somehow not respecting its origins within the peasant movements of Via Campesina and so on. So I really love that you're like, oh, we're not waiting for permission to assert our right to food sovereignty. That's a key. And I see that beautifully here in my area. I didn't mention that I live on Aboriginal lands that were once predominantly Salish and Kalispel. And I see, especially the Salish Culture Committee and young Salish people getting so excited about food sovereignty and relearning their foods and how to gather the appropriate foods and those kinds of things. And so I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Thanks, Neva. Anybody else want to brave the question about how to dismantle the state, or should we move on? Okay, so I picked a question for Ernesto. Do you believe that there is a role for large NGOs, such as Western conservation organizations, to play a role in supporting food sovereignty efforts? Or is the nonprofit industrial complex part of the problem?
That's a good one for me because I have worked with some of them. I guess what I see, I'll share, I'm not going to say which ones, but I will share a recent example of working. A lot of my work has been with smallholder coffee farmers in Latin America. And, a value chain that has a lot of the problems we're discussing here and starting with commodification. But we recently in the LC, because we've done so much work, were approached by two large nonprofits based in the US that do work with coffee farmers in developing countries, and about this idea that they had to do research on the situations of smallholder farmers. And we are really busy, and we were but we know these people and we like them, and we were sort of like, the first response that Martha and I had, the ALC co-director with me, was maybe we just shouldn't do it. We're too busy. We're doing more of this justice work, and there is this tension with these organizations. But we decided to have a conversation and push them and said, well, if what you want is just to collect more data to keep doing the same thing over and over again, we're not interested. If you're interested in asking some of the really hard questions that relate to justice and to the rights of those smallholder farmers, and in ways that could be supportive of food sovereignty, even though a lot of people that work with farmers that grow cacao and coffee never think about that. They think about just the commodity. Then maybe we're interested, and they were actually interested. They were actually receptive. So I think that going back to some of the first really hard question, I think that a lot of these questions are context specific. So when you are working in different countries, you will see these opportunities to really push the state through policy or social movements or not. And sometimes it's really hard to do that. So you have to go in a different direction. And that's why I think that these panels and just keeping the collaborative working together, keeping ourselves informed is so interesting, because we can share lessons and failures and successes about how we move the needle a little bit in our particular context. So I would say that it is possible to bring some of these organizations to do good work, but you have to negotiate the work from the onset as being a work grounded in food sovereignty, if that is what you want, or in food justice, and it being anti-racist, because there's great people everywhere. There's people doing good work in totalitarian states. So sometimes there's an opportunity to work with them to at least make some progress, right? The risk is that whatever you do might become co-opted. So that is what you have to weigh in. These are really hard questions, but I really appreciate them. Thank you.
Actually, does anybody else want to comment on the NGOs? Yeah, Mary.
Well, I know it was specific to NGOs, but we are seeing a lot of companies now also partnering with NGOs around, for instance, regenerative agriculture, especially in the upper Midwest and the Midwest here in the United States. And I don't think that they're always asking those hard questions that Ernesto was just talking about. And they're thinking ecologically, but not connecting it with these community organizations, with farmer livelihoods, with rethinking the system, because it's rooted in these relationships with these companies that, if we were cynical, we're like, oh, at least it's an ecological thing, but they're probably not going to pay farmers more for it. I mean, there's a lot of things happening in the regenerative agriculture space now that I'm pretty concerned about. And I think the questions that Ernesto was asking are really important.
That's a really good segue to the question I had chosen for Neva. So one of the panelists really appreciated the framing of incremental versus transformative change, which I think Mary had also brought up. And so this participant asks, how can we balance working on transformative change, which may take a while working on incremental changes that may be able to help people fulfill basic needs in the short term? And this, this comes back to Ernesto's remarks about how do we engage in specific projects on the ground, and how do we assess the extent to which those projects can be incremental or, broaden the space for transformation.
Did I mention I have to go?
Yeah.
Kidding. I'm just kidding. No, it's a great question, something I've thought about a lot. And, if I knew exactly how to create full, transformative change, and how to go from A to B, that's what I would do. But I having been an activist for a long time, as well as a scholar, I find it very difficult to have a big, broad, sweeping policy that changes things. That's why, like, I actually, here's a disclosure. A couple of days ago, I got really nervous about the fact that I had decided to focus on the right to know, because I was like, well, God, that seems so weak. Of course we should have the right to know. Let's go, further. But the more I thought about it, I realized, no, the knowledge is fundamental to democracy, right? And it depends on that. And so I guess my hope is that we have people working in a particular niches around the globe working for change. And some of that's going to be literally figuring out how to do soil health better. And other parts are going to be building cooperatives and making them last and keeping them honest and keeping them democratic. So I guess to me, my hope is, because I don't really, I'm open to suggestions, but my hope is that through a series of incremental changes, we can kind of get a cascade of bigger wins, essentially. The other thing is, I just touched on it and mentioned it in my talk, is, here in the United States, we need fundamental reform of our so-called democratic, republic, which is, campaign finance reform, getting rid of the electoral college. There are people calling for a democracy lobby, right? That would be nonpartisan, but that would try to get back at some of these things. I guess, so the last thing I'll say is there's a famous quote from Jane Addams where she says, something to the effect of, the solution to problems in democracy is more democracy. And that's kind of what I think we need to do, is figure out those places where we can make specific changes, such as the electoral college. It is possible. I don't mean to be so US centric, but this is where I live. So, for better
but all of our minds. Yeah, Mary.
I just think that that's really important, because we don't know that something that may be incremental might end up being transformative, and things that we think are going to be transformative reproduce relationships of power that weren't intended. And I think in the local food arena, there's been a big debate about that. And so I think that we don't know what are incremental and what are transformative. And I think that we always need to think they're linked, but also these have to be done in relationship with others. And so what seems incremental to me might seem very radical to somebody else, or what seems radical to me, others would like, oh my God, you're just, giving up to corporate power. So I think that we have to really do this in relationship with and respect for where people and organizations can put energy and work.
That's actually a great segue to the question I chose for SIG. One of the participants was talking about the disconnect between industrial agriculture and local agroecological food systems, and wonders how to make those connections more immediate and tangible so that industrial ag can be more directly confronted. And I was thinking specifically about initiatives to sort of put agroecological practices sort of in a drop-down menu kind of way into the industrial food system. And there's been a lot of controversy about that, as reproducing an industrial lock-in, even if you're doing slightly better on soil health. So that might be a good place to kind of push a little further onto this question about how do we pursue incremental change without being stuck in a lock-in that's not transformative.
Yeah, Hannah, that's the story of my life. Trying to be a bridge, but more and more with the challenges we're facing these days. The West Coast on fire and the extinction events. I think that is there still room for the bridges I try and build? I don't know. I think constructive activism and working a lot more about how do we build coalitions around what are the policy changes, which is why I think it's so great that you're having this conversation, that we can make, such as maybe we need to move away from fertilizer subsidies, that fossil fuel being so cheap is one of the big is that foundation of some of the problems in our current farming systems, is that then it disincentivizes any kind of diversification, right? So you can have regenerative agriculture, but it's still within the current paradigm. So if we can engage citizens, engage through op-eds, engage in many different ways, environmental. I mean, the small ways that I think are more important even than the agroecology, I mean, obviously building the knowledge base to show the costs of the current farming systems. Absolutely, I think that's important work. But myself, I'm trying to work more on trying to make my professional society include, when they talk about diversity, it's great, they're thinking about racial inclusion now and gender and all these things, but also trying to make sure they have environmental groups at the table. A simple thing that you would think would be ecologists, even Ecology Society, as well as American Society of Agronomy and Soil Science societies, they often don't engage with nature conservancy. They don't engage with ecologists. And I mean, they're ecologists and they don't necessarily engage with environmentalists and with constructive action, right? There's a lot of romanticization of the farmer or vilification of the farmer. And there's not enough, I think, constructive engagement. So I guess I come back to, yes, I do think we need to build those bridges, but we need to have partners, and whether it's citizens measuring water quality, we talk about big data for agriculture. It may not all be good for farmers, right? We may actually see people saying, look, there's a phosphorus spill here, and where is this coming from? Because there's so much non-point source pollution that's not necessarily being really monitored. And so if we could get citizen scientists saying, we see losses of fireflies in our areas and butterflies and increases in erosion, then that would put pressure on business as usual in agriculture, and constructive engagement about, well, how do we really change this? Oh, maybe we need to not just push off water quality prices, charge the costs all on water quality plants. Maybe we need to start with not just regulating manure, but let's regulate fertilizer, right? That's not regulated currently, or even tracked, because it would privacy, so-called issues. So, trying to bring to the table, the EPA, the environmental, some of the partners that have surprisingly been left out. Education. To me, one of the most exciting things is perennial grains is now, people think it's a thing. It's still really just being created, but it's in high school textbooks. Perennial grain shows all these massive root systems. You try and buy one, that's actually almost impossible. It's a little bit of intermediate wheatgrass, trademark Kernza, but that's still not really developed, right? Perennial wheat. These are things that are happening outside of academia, although there's certainly a lot of effort to link together different people. And I think we need to bring to the table a really broad coalition, at least some of us. Some of us may want to work very closely with certain indigenous groups or food sovereignty, and that's brilliant. We need that work too, but we also need perhaps really challenging regenerative agriculture, but we're going to have people at our side. And I would say that consumer organizations, environmental organizations, education, even health, more and more people are realizing the role of agriculture and health with this COVID issues.
So Sig, we're just about out of time. So what I want to do is, first of all, thank everyone for your contributions today. It's been an incredibly stimulating conversation, and we've had almost 200, I think we had 240 attendees. So you can imagine that that's not counting whoever's on Facebook and who might watch it later. So you are reaching a really wide audience, and that's really to be commended. I just want to close by giving all the panelists a final word. And so I'm going to go in reverse order. We'll end with Charlotte, and just take your last minute to have any final remarks or any kind of instructions for us as we go forward into this world, what you might want us to take away from this morning's conversation. So I'll start, because we're going backwards, I'll start with Neva, and then we'll end up with Charlotte, and then I'll give a thank you to everybody, and then we'll go ahead and close. So Neva, last words. Oops, you're muted, Neva.
People have been trying to mute me for a long time. I want to thank you all for this discussion. It's really been inspiring, and I appreciate everyone organizing who organized it. You know, I think if any of us had a magic answer, you know, we would have said it, but we can look collaboratively and think about putting together the pieces of this puzzle to create transformation. And you know, times are tough right now. If you look outside my window, you can't see very far. You can't see the mountains. We're having a very unhealthy air. We've got this pandemic, you know, all these things. But I'm still hopeful. And by that, I mean, I'm willing to roll up my sleeves and work on things and try to get them done. Not that we're going to sit on the sidelines and just be blindly optimistic. So I'm ready to work with whoever wants to and try to make some transformative changes.
Thank you so much, Neva. So Mary.
Well, thank you. It's been really amazing and wonderful to sit and think with everybody and to discuss. And I guess I would just echo everything that Neva just said, and thank you all for organizing this. And I'm interested in going back and rewatching it and picking up on more things. I think Cornel West said it once that he wasn't optimistic about the state of the Black man in America, but he was hopeful, because hope is about the struggle. And I echo that. What Neva was saying is hope is the struggle, and I'm hopeful.
Great, thank you, Mary. Dig.
So I just saw someone say, "Is this feminism part of this?" In the Q&A. Well, of course it is, and it's really great to feel like there's so many more people at the table now that in the Black Lives Matters movements, you know, seeing very traditional groups starting to grapple with some of these really racial and other justice issues coming to the fore. It's an exciting time too, although it's really horrific. Just assuming you can breathe and then finding that the whole West Coast is in trouble is really playing with my head. So it's a really difficult time, but it's time for reflection, which is part of this whole process. It's time for reflection, and then this is participatory research and action, guys. There's time for reflection, there's time for action together, and there's time for learning together. So I'm thrilled to be part of this learning process. And like Neva said, I'll ready to show up.
Thank you, Sig. Ernesto.
Again, very grateful to everybody. This has been really inspiring. And I think that I want to commend again your working group, because when I started reading the document, I became incredibly interested. And I think one word of action and moving forward is keep being bold in our proposals to really get at the difficult issues, right? Of the food regime is really entrenched, and it's going to take some really bold action and radical action. And I think for me is really important to approach all these things with humility, because it is incredibly complex. And we need to talk more. We need to have more of these dialogues in order to share, to support each other moving forward. And finally, just like try to bring to our day-to-day and everything we do, some of these notions of relationality, respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and rights. No matter where we are and in what context, how can we always remind people how important they are? You know, in the United States, we're engaging a lot with anti-racism, and that is something that for me, I see people getting excited, and I'm like, how are we gonna keep this going for a long time? It's deep, hard work, and we just need to embrace it. But I think together it's a lot easier. So thank you so much for the opportunity and everybody's comments, and it's been great to be here.
Thank you so much, Ernesto. And then I'd just like to invite Charlotte to give us any final remarks and close our meeting.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, I want to say to everyone, Ushak Shitleetsu, which is a form of thank you in my language. I thank all of you. This was a great panel. I really enjoyed this listening to all of you, and that we could come together in this collaborative and respectful way. I also want to thank Hannah and Evan and all the other coordinators and UBC as well, and some of the organizations at UBC for supporting this, and also to all the attendees. We don't get to see them. I've been on these Zoom meetings before, and you usually get to see people, and I can go and check out who that I know is in there. I can't see anyone, but thank you all for joining us. And just, you know, to echo what the other panelists have said as well, is that, you know, we really are living in a time of uncertainty. There's things that we can do to make some changes, some little changes. I would say in just speaking up for each other. For one, we've been fighting hard as Indigenous peoples to have the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples adopted by states, and we've seen some movement in some states, but not far enough where we have the recognition that's constitutionally protected. But again, we are doing our own thing in our communities and not waiting for these rights to be acknowledged, you know, so, but that is something that we can all engage in these larger spaces. Also, in living in this time of uncertainty, there really is, we need to focus on what is hope and what is possible. So hope and possibility being at the center of these actions we're taking, and what we see today especially around social and racial injustice, that we have to bring those into conversations around food justice. And let's make this a movement and not just a moment in time. If we can keep saying that what is happening is going to create a larger movement rather than just this significant moment around racial and social injustice, that we will create change and we will see something positive, and there will be a move towards this areas around hope and possibility. So I want to leave everyone with that. Clicko, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So this closes our webinar for today. To all of the attendees, you'll be receiving an email with a link to the recording next week. And I just please welcome any feedback, and we look forward to working together on hopeful projects into the future. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Hannah. That was great. I appreciated it.
That's fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wish we could
Thanks,
all
Hannah and
go out to
Evan.
lunch now. Normally we'd go to lunch.
Yeah.